In a few weeks' time, we will mark the one-year anniversary of the war in the Middle East. It has been almost 1 year since Hamas's horrific terrorist rampage on October 7th, which killed 1,200 innocent Israelis and took hundreds of hostages, including Americans. And as I have said many times, Israel had an absolute right to defend itself and respond to the Hamas attack. But tragically, Prime Minister Netanyahu's extremist government has not simply waged war against Hamas. It has waged all-out war against the Palestinian people. Israel has conducted this war with little regard for innocent civilians, bombing indiscriminately, and severely restricting the humanitarian relief operation needed by desperate people. After nearly 1 year of this carnage, out of a population of some 2.2 million people, more than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed and nearly 95,000 injured, 60% of whom are women, children, or elderly people. Let me repeat, 60% of whom are women, children, or elderly people. Madam President, Netanyahu's policies have trampled on international law, made life unlivable in Gaza, and created one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern history. We cannot continue to turn a blind eye to the scale of the suffering caused by this all-out war against the Palestinian people. 136,000 casualties, most of whom are civilians. The full toll is likely even higher, with thousands of bodies buried beneath the rubble. Madam President, 90% of Gazans, 90% of the people in Gaza have been displaced from their homes. 1.9 million people. Many families have been displaced again and again and again, forced to uproot their lives and pick their way across a war zone with their children and what little they can carry. These are poor people, going from place to place amid bombing and total destruction. When these families find, finally, a safe place to seek refuge, perhaps setting up a tent in a so-called safe zone, they are often then forced to evacuate due to renewed Israeli bombing. Madam President, few of these people even have homes to ever return to. More than 60% of Gaza's housing has been damaged or destroyed, including 221,000 housing units that have been completely destroyed. Imagine going from place to place knowing that you're never going to be able to return to your home. Today, as a result of the devastation of housing in Gaza, more than 1 million people are homeless. And I would ask my colleagues to try to think for a moment what it means to be carrying your children from place to place in the heat, without food, without water, knowing that your home that you came from has been destroyed. And that's what's going on today. Madam President, what we are witnessing now is not just the loss of human life, as severe and horrible as that is. Gaza's civilian infrastructure has been devastated, including water and sewage systems. Raw sewage runs through the streets, spreading disease. Clean water is still in short supply. Most of the roads in Gaza are impassable, torn up by bombing and bulldozers. and there is virtually no electricity right now. But it's not just Gaza's infrastructure. The Netanyahu government has systematically, and I've talked to doctors about this, devastated the healthcare system in Gaza, knocking 19 hospitals out of service and killing more than 800 healthcare workers. So you got 95,000 people who have been injured, including a lot of children, and yet 19 hospitals have been knocked out of service. The World Health Organization has recorded thousands of attacks on healthcare facilities. Not surprisingly, with the collapse of the healthcare system under the strain, diseases like hepatitis, dysentery, polio, and other infections have taken hold. Madam President, Gaza has 12 universities. Every single one of them has been bombed, as have hundreds of schools. 88% of all school buildings in Gaza have been damaged. Every university bombed, 88% of all school buildings in Gaza have been damaged, and more than 500 people have been killed while sheltering in UN schools. There are many, many hundreds of thousands of children in Gaza. It's a young Palestinian population, is by and large young, a lot of children. Virtually none of them have been in school since this war began. And Madam President, as horrific and unspeakable as all of this is, there is something even worse taking place in Gaza now. And that is as a result of Israeli restrictions on humanitarian aid. People in Gaza are now starving to death. Leading experts from the UN and other aid organizations estimate that some 495,000 Palestinians, a quarter of the population, face starvation. These groups estimate that more than 50,000 children require treatment now for acute malnutrition and are at risk of starving. There are 50,000 kids facing malnutrition. And I'm not a doctor, but I know enough to tell you that will impact these children for the rest of their lives. That's what childhood malnutrition does. Malnourished women struggle to breastfeed their newborns. Formula is inaccessible, and even when available, it cannot be used without reliable sources of clean water. According to the UN, virtually every humanitarian organization functioning in Gaza, there is one primary reason for this starvation and suffering, and that is that Israel has severely restricted the amount of humanitarian aid, including food, water, and medical supplies that can reach the desperate people of Gaza. This, Madam President, is a clear violation of U.S. and international law, not just immoral, not just outrageous, but a clear violation of U.S. and international law. And, Madam President, every day, every single day, the bombardment continues. Bombing and shelling carried out with U.S.-provided weaponry, often financed in large part by American taxpayers. U.S. weapons financed by U.S. taxpayers. In the last year alone, Congress has voted to send more than $10 billion in American taxpayer dollars to the extremist Israeli government to buy more of the bombs and more of the weapons they are using to wage war against the Palestinian people. Madam President, enough is enough. U.S. complicity in this horrific war must end. With a group of colleagues, I will soon be introducing a number of joint resolutions of disapproval, which would block some $20 billion in new arms sales to Israel. Resolutions of disapproval are the only tool Congress has to block arms sales which are inconsistent with established U.S. and international law. The Senate will vote on these measures. And let me outline briefly why it is critical that we prevent these sales from going forward. Madam President, I have laid out the horrible reality of the situation in Gaza, but the sad truth is that much of this carnage has been carried out with U.S.-provided military equipment. Put simply, providing more offensive weapons to continue this disastrous war would be immoral. It would also be illegal. These sales directly contradict the stated purpose of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 and the Arms Export Control Act. These laws require that U.S. arms transfers to foreign countries must be consistent with internationally recognized human rights, advance U.S. foreign policy interests, and avoid U.S. complicity with any human rights violations. That is the purpose of these laws. Madam President, during the August recess, the administration sent to Congress official notice for several sales to Israel that clearly do not meet these criteria. The arms sales total over $20 billion and include transfers of joint direct attack munitions, or JDAMs, 120-millimeter tank rounds, 120-millimeter high-explosive mortar rounds, medium tactical vehicles, and up to 50 new F-15 fighter aircraft, as well as upgrades for some of Israel's current F-15s. All of these systems have been used in Gaza, causing massive death and suffering to innocent men, women, and children. The JDAMs and 120-millimeter tank rounds in particular have been used indiscriminately and are responsible for a significant portion of the civilian casualties. Reliable human rights monitors have painstakingly documented numerous specific incidents involving these systems, leading to unacceptable civilian death and harm. There is a mountain of documentary evidence regarding this. Hundreds of eyewitness testimonies, photographs, videos, and satellite imagery all underscore one simple point. These weapons are being used in violation of U.S. and international law. I have a list here of some of the most egregious incidents involving these systems. Tragically, the list is too long for me to read here on the floor, but, Madam President, I ask that this list be included in the congressional record.
Without objection.
Madam President, the administration's report pursuant to National Security Memorandum 20 concluded that, quote, it is reasonable to assess that defense articles have been used by Israeli security forces since October 7th in instances inconsistent with its international humanitarian law obligations or with established best practices for mitigating civilian harm, end of quote. That's the administration. The report stated that, quote, high levels of civilian casualties raise substantial questions as to whether the Israeli Defense Force is using effective civilian harm mitigation effectively in all cases, end of quote. That's the administration. Madam President, it's not just the civilian casualties and the violations of international human rights. Other provisions of U.S. law are also applicable. Section 6201 of the Foreign Assistance Act also states that, quote, no assistance shall be furnished to any country when it is made known to the President that the government of such country prohibits or otherwise restricts directly or indirectly the transport or delivery of United States humanitarian assistance, end of quote. Madam President, the whole world has witnessed Israel's restriction of humanitarian aid. The UN and virtually every humanitarian group says that Israel's restrictive policies are the primary cause of the humanitarian catastrophe now taking place in Gaza. The administration says as much, admitting that, quote, Israel did not fully cooperate with the United States government efforts, and the United States government supported international efforts to maximize humanitarian assistance flow to and distribution within Gaza, end of quote. In fact, frankly, that severely understates the reality. Madam President, no matter how people here in Washington may try to spin it, the simple fact is that we must end our complicity in Israel's illegal and indiscriminate military campaign, which has caused mass civilian death and suffering. Madam President, the law also says that arms sales must advance U.S. foreign policy interests. If we're going to sell arms, they must advance U.S. foreign policy interests. These transfers, again, fall far short. These sales would reward Netanyahu's extremist government even as it flouts, openly flouts, U.S. policy goals at every turn, and in fact drags the United States closer to a regional war. For months, the Biden administration has been trying to reach a ceasefire deal that would secure the release of the hostages and allow massive amounts of humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza. Every time a deal appears close, Netanyahu moves the goalposts, introducing new demands and torpedoing the deal. It is clear to me that Netanyahu is prolonging the war in order to cling to power and avoid prosecution at home for corruption. That is why hundreds of thousands of Israelis routinely take to the streets to protest his policies. But it's not just his sabotage of a ceasefire for hostage deal. Netanyahu has also overseen record settlement expansion in the West Bank and unleashed a wave of violence there that has killed nearly 700 Palestinians, including 150 children killed over the last 11 months. Because so much focus is on Gaza, we are not paying attention to the disaster taking place in the West Bank. Madam President, Americans have also been caught up in this bloodshed. On September 6th, Israeli security forces shot a 26-year-old American recent college graduate in the head near an illegal settlement in the West Bank. In January, they shot and killed a 17-year-old American high school senior from Louisiana. In February, they shot and killed another 17-year-old American from Florida. And in October of last year, they nearly killed a constituent of mine from Vermont, Dylan Collins, a journalist for Agence France-Presse, with 2 tank rounds. 6 journalists were wounded in an attack which killed a Reuters journalist. The group was clearly marked as press. These are the same tank rounds the administration would provide to Israel in this sale. Needless to say, there has been zero accountability for these deaths. And of course, there has been no accountability for the repeated Israeli settler attacks enabled by security forces on Palestinian towns and villages. No meaningful response to the burning of Palestinian homes and businesses. Nothing but silence in the face of a concerted right-wing Israeli effort to illegally annex the West Bank. Yet those are the Netanyahu extremist government policies that these sales would reward. And I say that to my colleagues. All of this is going on. And should our response to Mr. Netanyahu say, keep it up, here are more arms, here are more money? A government that has caused mass civilian deaths, flouted U.S. and international law, and that is actively undermining key U.S. policies, goals in the region, should not be receiving more financial aid from America and should not be receiving military weaponry from the United States. Madam President, passing a joint resolution to block these sales will make clear to the Netanyahu government that they cannot continue to ignore the U.S. government's demands for an immediate ceasefire and the release of the hostages. It will put pressure on its extremist government to change Israel's military approach and avert a regional war. And it may, just may, begin to restore a shred of U.S. credibility abroad. Madam President, passing a joint resolution of disapproval is not only the right thing to do, it is not only the legal and appropriate thing to do, it is also what the American people want us to do. According to a June 5th poll from CBS News, 61% of Americans oppose sending weapons and supplies to Israel, including 77% of Democrats, 62% of independents, and many Republicans as well. And that poll is consistent with earlier polls. President, this is not a new or radical idea. The United States routinely conditions military aid, arms sales, and security cooperation with every other country. This ain't new. We have done it over and over again. And we have done it many times before with Israel. Not a new idea. It is only in recent years that the idea of leveraging aid to Israel to secure policy changes has become controversial. President Ronald Reagan, I say to my Republican colleagues, suspended delivery of F-16 fighter jets to Israel over its raid on the Ozark reactor in Iraq, threatened to suspend military aid to end Israel's bombardment of Beirut, and again threatened to stop military aid to force an Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon in 1982. That was President Ronald Reagan. President Jimmy Carter similarly leveraged aid to change Israeli policies in Lebanon. In 1991, then Secretary of State James Baker threatened to withhold $10 billion in loan guarantees unless Israel stopped settlement expansion. In other words, using arms sales and military aid as leverage is not a new idea done under Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. There is also recent precedent of Congress acting to stop the indiscriminate bombing of civilians. In 2019, Congress passed a series of JRDs to block arms sales to Saudi Arabia over its bombing campaign in Yemen. At that point, the Saudi coalition was directly responsible for roughly 8,000 civilian deaths over 4 years, mostly from airstrikes. Israel has killed 41,000 in less than a year. Madam President, blocking these sales would also be in keeping with actions taken by the international community and some of our closest allies. So what I'm suggesting here is not unique in the world, taking place all over the world, including some of our closest allies. There has been widespread condemnation of Israel's conduct during this war from governments around the world, international institutions, and humanitarian organizations. The United Kingdom recently suspended 30 export licenses for a range of armaments after concluding there was an unacceptable risk they could be used in violation of international humanitarian law. Germany has not approved an offensive weapon transfer since March. Italy, Spain, Canada, Belgium, and the Netherlands have taken similar steps. United Nations bodies have called for an end to the arms shipments fueling the conflict. Madam President, we cannot continue to ignore what the extremist Netanyahu government is doing in Gaza. We cannot continue to be complicit in this humanitarian disaster. The time is long overdue for the U.S. Senate to act, and we must act. I hope my colleagues will support this effort on the floor, and my office is ready to answer any questions that senators may have. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. With